We keep nuclear weapons underground in this country, in big, they call them silos. They are shaped like farm silos that hold grain, but instead of going up, they go down. And all over the northern plain states, we have these underground silos, these massive underground fortresses, which hold huge nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missiles in Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota. And a lot of them, especially the first ones that we built, are up in that northern tier of the country because they are a Cold War relic. And the idea was that you'd want them in the inland northern tier of the U.S., A, so you'd have plenty of time to see any incoming threat to those sites flying in from either coast. So you wanted them way inland. But B, you also wanted them way north, so you could fire those intercontinental ballistic missiles north over the Arctic Circle as the fastest path to go hit Moscow, right? To go hit Russia, or I guess the Soviet Union, since it was a Cold War thing. And there were some earlier missile silos with different kinds of weapons, but mostly what we think of when we think of those nuclear missile silos on the northern plains, mostly what we think of are the Minuteman sites for these huge 50-foot-long nuclear-armed intercontinental missiles, the Minuteman missiles. And those Minuteman missile sites in Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, those started to go in the early to mid-1960s. And they are still there and still functioning today, because we as a country still have thousands of live nuclear weapons that we maintain in a constant state of readiness because sure, why not? But if you're going to decide as a country to do that, one thing you can't then do is let those nuclear weapons and those nuclear weapons sites fall into disrepair, right? This isn't like old books or soccer balls that you stashed in a milk crate on a shelf in your garage and forgot about, and, you know, look, the mice got to them. Right? These are real live nuclear weapons that need upkeep and modernization. They need care and tending. So a few months ago, there was a review of the physical condition of these decades-old silos, where to this day we keep hundreds and hundreds of these huge nuclear weapons. And at the end of that review, the Air Force reported, we need to dig all new silos for our nuclear missiles. Turns out these silos we dug starting in the 1960s aren't going to last forever. They're leaking, they're crumbling, they're no place to keep live nuclear weapons and the crews that watch them and maintain them and stand ready to launch them 24 hours a day. So we need new silos. We need new physical sites for these ground-based nukes. And if that sounds expensive, you are right. But also you've got to, right? I mean, maybe we shouldn't actually have these nuclear weapons. That's an argument that might be worth having. But if we're not having that argument and we are going to keep these nuclear missiles, all these thousands of them, right, then we do have to keep them safely. If we're going to have the nukes, we've got no choice but to maintain them and upgrade them as needed to keep them safe. Right. Right. We can all agree on that. Right. Right. Well, President Donald Trump is now robbing the ground-based nuclear missiles safety and modernization budget for himself. He is robbing that budget. Quote, no one wants to discuss a mysterious $934 million transfer of funds from the Pentagon project to modernize America's aging ground-based nuclear missiles. But that amount, $934 million, was slipped into an obscure Pentagon document sent to Capitol Hill as a transfer to an unnamed classified project. In recent weeks, congressional budget sleuths have come to think that that amount almost certainly includes the renovation of the new gold-adorned airplane from Qatar that President Trump desperately wants to be in the air before his term is over. Air Force officials privately acknowledge, quote, dipping into nuclear modernization funds for the airplane project. That's from reporters David Sanger and Eric Schmidt at the New York Times. And just to underscore that last point again, just in case that didn't sink in, they actually say it twice in the article. When asked last week, the Air Force said it simply could not discuss the cost or anything else about the airplane because it is classified. But Air Force officials privately concede that they are paying for the renovations of the Qatari Air Force One with the transfer from the Pentagon program to rebuild America's aging, leaky ground-launched nuclear missile system. So our aging, leaky, ground-launched nuclear missile system needs some attention, needs a little TLC, because, you know, they're huge armed nuclear missiles under the ground in Montana and Wyoming and all over the place in silos built for them, I don't know, 60 years ago. So they need a little TLC, our live nuclear weapons, but Trump is taking the money from that program for himself to instead fix up this plane that he wants, which, yes, he will use as Air Force One while he's president. But then, remember, he plans to keep it for himself after his presidency as part of his presidential library, which is a thing that does not exist. Diverting $934 million in taxpayer funds from the Pentagon for nuclear weapon safety to instead making sure he gets the gold inlay he knows he deserves on the plane he plans to take with him when he goes. Everywhere, all over the world, these guys are all the same, and they all want gold toilets. They all want to rob the country they lead blind, to give them gold gewgaws that make them feel special. But that's more fun than actually governing, right? On the actual governing front, while we're on the subject of planes, let's see, how's it going at the FAA? Well, last week, we just had word of the near miss in North Dakota when a commercial pilot with a plane full of passengers had to take emergency evasive action after a near midair collision with a B-52 bomber doing a flyover at the North Dakota State Fair. No warning, apparently, to the B-52 or the commercial aircraft. Then Friday, we've got another commercial pilot having to take another emergency evasive action with a plane full of passengers. He dropped the plane into what passengers said felt like a nosedive to avoid another potential midair collision about which those pilots had no warning, except from the automated collision avoidance system that set off screaming alarms.
In a startling revelation, a significant portion of the U.S. defense budget intended for the maintenance and modernization of the nation's aging nuclear missile silos has been diverted to fund an extravagant renovation of a Boeing 747, acquired from Qatar, to serve as a luxurious Air Force One for President Donald Trump. According to a recent investigation, approximately $934 million was quietly transferred from a Pentagon project aimed at upgrading the country's ground-based nuclear arsenal, raising concerns about national security priorities and fiscal accountability. The U.S. maintains hundreds of nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, primarily Minuteman missiles, housed in underground silos across Montana, Wyoming, and North Dakota. These silos, constructed in the early to mid-1960s as Cold War fortifications, are strategically located in the northern plains to allow ample response time to potential threats from either coast and to enable rapid launches over the Arctic Circle toward adversaries like Russia. However, a recent Air Force review revealed that these decades-old silos are deteriorating, with issues such as leaks and crumbling infrastructure rendering them inadequate for housing live nuclear weapons. The report underscored the urgent need to construct new silos to ensure the safety and reliability of the nation's nuclear arsenal, a critical component of U.S. defense strategy. The decision to redirect nearly $1 billion from this essential modernization effort has sparked outrage among congressional budget analysts and defense experts. The funds, discreetly reallocated through an obscure Pentagon document, are believed to be financing the transformation of a Qatari Boeing 747 into a lavish Air Force One, complete with gold inlays and other opulent features. Reports indicate that President Trump intends to retain this aircraft for personal use after his presidency, potentially as part of a future presidential library. Air Force officials, while publicly tight-lipped due to the classified nature of the project, have privately acknowledged dipping into nuclear modernization funds to cover the airplane's costly renovations, highlighting a troubling prioritization of personal luxury over national security. This diversion of funds comes at a time when the safety and maintenance of the U.S. nuclear arsenal are paramount. The Minuteman missile sites, operational since the 1960s, require constant upkeep to remain functional and secure. Neglecting these facilities risks compromising the readiness of the nation's nuclear deterrent, a cornerstone of its defense posture. Critics argue that if the U.S. is committed to maintaining thousands of nuclear weapons, it must prioritize their safe storage and operational integrity over discretionary expenditures like a customized presidential aircraft. Compounding concerns about governmental priorities, recent incidents in the aviation sector suggest broader mismanagement under the current administration. Last week, a commercial airliner in North Dakota narrowly avoided a mid-air collision with a B-52 bomber conducting an unscheduled flyover at a state fair, with no prior warning issued to either aircraft. Days later, another commercial pilot was forced to execute emergency evasive maneuvers, described by passengers as a terrifying nosedive, to avoid a collision after receiving alerts from an automated collision avoidance system. Additionally, a fire on a commercial aircraft in Denver prompted the evacuation of 173 passengers and 6 crew members, and Newark Airport, a major hub, faced significant delays due to a shortage of air traffic control personnel. These incidents have raised questions about the administration's decision to dismiss hundreds of critical air safety personnel from the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, earlier this year, a move critics argue has undermined aviation safety. The redirection of nuclear modernization funds and the series of near misses in U.S. airspace underscore broader concerns about governance and resource allocation. As the nation grapples with maintaining its aging nuclear infrastructure and ensuring public safety, these developments highlight the challenges of balancing national security imperatives with administrative priorities, prompting calls for greater transparency and accountability in federal spending.